Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this seminar for CDL's 2021 online open house. I hope to see you all in person really soon, but in the meantime, enjoy this presentation. So this presentation is on research that we've done looking at the yields and sustainability of various early tapping and taphole rejuvenation strategies. And so when I'm referring to taphole rejuvenation strategies, what I'm talking about is making a single taphole and then subsequently doing something to freshen it, to either ream it wider, drill it deeper, or even both. And so there's a lot of different reasons why producers might be considering either early tapping with or without some kind of subsequent rejuvenation or freshening. And one of the reasons is simply to maximize yields. So to potentially take advantage of the early sap flows that occur in, say, early January or even November and late October, just to increase the overall production for the year. And kind of on a similar note, there are some practical reasons why people consider tapping early. And, in a large operation where you've got 30, 50, 100,000 taps, tapping early without any kind of freshening, tapping early is simply a practical necessity in order to make sure that you have all of your taps in before the standard spring sap flow season begins. And so, but there are other sort of more pressing reasons that producers might be thinking about some of these strategies, especially taphole rejuvenation strategies. And one is to simply mitigate the trend of the earlier season end. So we've seen over the years both, and we can see this with several indicators. One is the NAS data that shows the season open and close dates, which have been trending towards ending earlier since that data has been being collected. But we can also see this in things like looking at when bud break occurs each year. And this graph here actually shows the date of bud break at the Proctor Center since 1990. And you can see that it fluctuates around the mean for each year. There's variation every year, but overall, the long-term trend since that data was begun to be collected is for bud break to occur earlier and earlier. So our season is ending earlier. And so early tapping is one potential way to potentially mitigate the loss of production, or basically sort of adjust to that new normal of an earlier season end. But especially in a year like this one, what's fresh on all of our minds is potentially using some of these strategies to mitigate the risks of an unusual or really terrible standard sap flow season. And when I was first doing this work and making these presentations, I would always point to 2012 as sort of the indicator poster child of the type of year that causes us to think about doing some of these strategies. 2012 was a year where we had very early warm temperatures right in the heart of the maple production season that caused the season to end early. But there are other ways that we can sort of Mother Nature and what we're given in terms of the weather conditions can impact our standard spring sap flow season. So we can have a cold season with fewer than usual sap flow days, or a warm season with fewer than usual sap flow days. And thank you, 2021. You appear to have given us all three as a super great gift. Added to very low sap sugar content. So after a year like 2021, I'm sure that many of us are thinking even more about some of these strategies, tapping early or with or without these subsequent rejuvenation strategies. We're thinking about these to possibly mitigate some of the negative impacts that we saw based on what Mother Nature gave us to work with this year. And so, like much of what I do in maple research, tapping in the fall and investigating tapping early is certainly nothing new. People have been looking at yields from tapping in the fall all the way since back in the 1960s and as recently as 2008. But even with this more recent study, well, I should say, first of all, that none of these studies found any gains in yield from tapping in the fall. But even if we look back as recently as 2008, since that time, the level of vacuum that we're able to achieve with the taphole, our sanitation practices, and basically lots of different factors have come into play to actually really potentially make tapping in fall a little bit potentially more beneficial than it was even in 2008 with some of the newer practices that we're able to implement. So we felt that it was worth taking a look at again. And so there's a lot of questions with respect to these strategies, and certainly chief among them are questions related to the actual yields that we're getting and the overall economics of any of these strategies. So obviously the biggest question is, with any of these early tapping strategies, with or without subsequent rejuvenation, are we actually getting more sap than a standard spring taphole? Or does it just kind of feel like we're getting more sap because maybe we ream that taphole and we get some good sap flow for a couple of days, or we're collecting sap for months and months during the season, so it sort of feels like we're getting more. Another question related to this is actually the flip side of that. Are some of these strategies going to give us potentially less sap overall due to earlier taphole drying and the wound response of the tree? So in other words, if we tap in the fall, even with subsequent rejuvenation, has there been enough compartmentalization of that wound to actually reduce overall yields? Basically, it can't be compensated for even if we go in and freshen that taphole later. And then the bottom line for all of these is, even if some of these strategies give us more sap than standard tapping, is it enough to actually increase or offset the increased costs of implementing these strategies? And those are costs in terms of actual labor. Like obviously some of these we're visiting the tree twice, using new spouts, and certainly there's a cost in the additional non-conductive wood that we're adding with some of these rejuvenation strategies, or with all of these rejuvenation strategies. And that kind of ties into the many questions related to the sustainability of these practices. So with rejuvenation treatments where we're reaming wider or deeper or both, we know that we're going to get a greater amount of non-conductive wood because we're making a bigger hole than our single taphole. But the question is, or one of the questions is, are we potentially getting disproportionately more non-conductive wood than a single undisturbed taphole of the same size? So that is a potential question that's really important to answer, because obviously the amount of non-conductive wood we're adding is ultimately going to impact our long-term yields. So if we're adding a whole bunch more, then that is going to be potentially shooting ourselves in the feet for our future yields. And then some other questions have to do with the fact that we're tapping very early. So instead of having a taphole wound that is open for several weeks, maybe 2 months, maybe we're having taphole wounds that are open since October and November for many, many months. Is it possible that that might make that taphole and that particular tree at an increased risk of infection and subsequent decay? That is something to consider. And then a third issue, which is really important to consider, but also somewhat difficult to wrap our heads around experimentally, or basically to answer experimentally, is these early tapping strategies involve removing carbohydrate resources, sugar resources from the tree during a pretty critical time for the tree. And I'd like to show this slide, or this figure, even though it's a pretty old one, but it shows really nicely what the concentration of sugar is in the xylem sap all throughout the dormant period. And so what we're used to focusing on is the xylem sap sugar here in March and early April, basically when the concentration of sugar in the xylem gets really high as the tree begins to exit dormancy. And it is typically, or in sort of traditional maple production, it's this particular area or period of time that we're focused on and that we're harvesting that sap that has those carbohydrate resources in it. But with fall tapping and early tapping, we're exploiting or extracting those carbohydrate resources throughout this dormant period. And the reason that there are sugars there in the xylem sap to begin with throughout this period is not just kind of by happenstance or they happen to be there, but they're present in the sap at that time because they're important for the tree to be able to survive during that dormant period. So while the trees don't have leaves on them, there's no way for them to conduct photosynthesis to make sugar, to make food. And so it's those stored sugars, both in the wood and that we see in the sap during this time, that the tree is relying on to stay alive while it doesn't have leaves to photosynthesize. They also do other things like protect the tree from freezing, the trees and tissues from freezing, as well as helping to reestablish the water column as we get closer to the end of back into the growing season. But the bottom line is they're important for the tree. And so if we are, instead of just focusing our sap extraction, our carbohydrate extraction on this small period of time, but instead moving it toward the entire period of time where the tree has no leaves, then perhaps we might be having some bigger impact on the tree health and longevity than we are with standard spring tapping. That's a really difficult question to get our scientific question answering around, but it is something worth keeping in mind. And we'll come back to, it's something especially on our minds after a year like this one, where we had very low sap sugar content overall. So keep this in mind, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation. So when it came to doing the study that we were going to do, I just talked about all sorts of complex questions, but really anyone that knows me knows I like to keep things simple. And so when beginning to investigate this question in this area, this topic, we wanted to basically see if there was a there before going on to investigate any of those more difficult questions. So in other words, we wanted to see whether any of these practices actually resulted in net increased yields and net overall benefit relative to standard spring tapping before we even worried about whether they were sustainable or not. Because obviously, if they're not going to give us any more yield or any greater net yield, then they're not worth doing in the first place, and we can just throw them away. So the objective of our study was to determine if any of these early tapping practices, with or without rejuvenation, led to overall net increased yields relative to standard spring tapping. And I just want to mention, because it's very important to mention, that this study was initially funded by the North American Maple Syrup Council Research Fund, as well as the USDA ACER Access and Development Program. And then, as you'll see in a moment, the equipment costs for this particular study were really, really high. And LaPierre Equipment was able to help us make this affordable to be able to purchase the equipment for this study. So we want to thank all of the sponsors that made this study happen. It's very, very important, and we really thank them. So how do we do this? Not easy to do in practice, but easy to think about in the setup. So we had 7 different early tapping and rejuvenation treatments, which I'll show you in a minute, plus a springtime tapping control. So that's a total of 8 different treatments. And we had 10 trees in each of those treatments. So 80 trees total. In each of those treatment groups, the average diameter of the tree was 13 inches. And the diameter was stratified across the group. So in other words, the size of the trees were equal in each of those 8 different groups of trees. Each one of our trees was tubed or plumbed separately into its own 30-gallon sap collection chamber. And so now if your mind is going to your maple equipment catalog, you can kind of understand how expensive this was to do. And so each one of those trees is plumbed into its own separate sap collection chamber. The whole system is under vacuum. And then basically once the trees are tapped in with their respective treatments, we then go and measure the sap volume and sugar content of that sap 5 to 7 times during the season. Obviously, when you're tapping in October all the way through April, it requires a few times. Measuring that 30 gallons is not enough space. And so then at the end of the production season, we're able to calculate the total yield, both the sap and the syrup equivalent yield for that tree. And then we can use that to calculate the average total yield for each of those 8 different treatments. And then in addition to that, we repeated the study exactly the same, or almost exactly the same, for 3 years. And that enables us to calculate an overall average over 3 years with different weather, et cetera, an overall average for all of these treatments. And that's pretty important to do in a study like this, where the weather in one fall for sap flow could be really different from the weather the next fall. And so it's really important to do a study like this for multiple years so that you can see over time what the actual average of one of these treatments is going to be. And so here are our treatments that we used. So all of our treatments are relative, or were relative, to a standard spring taphole. So our spring control treatment was a 5/16 inch taphole with 1.5 inch depth, tapped at the normal time, basically for the Proctor Center's production operation. And so for us, just like you, that is a balance between the weather that's happening at the time, as well as the operational needs, sort of the way our operation works. So this tends to be just after the midpoint of February for us and doesn't vary too much from year to year. We had 4 fall treatments, fall tapping treatments. So we had fall control tapholes. These were tapholes that were the same size as our spring tapholes, but they were tapped in the fall, and then nothing else was done to them. We had a fall deeper treatment. So these were tapholes that were the same dimensions as our spring controls, tapped in the fall, and then subsequently re-drilled deeper to 2.5 inches on the same date that we tapped our spring control trees. And then we also had a fall ream deep treatment. These were tapholes that we put in as 1/4 inch tapholes in the fall. And then on the same date as our spring tapping, we reamed them to 5/16 inch and also deeper to 2.5 inches. And then we had this 4th fall treatment, which was fall second hole. Basically, we put in a standard taphole in the fall. And then on the same date as our spring control trees were tapped, we drilled a completely separate new taphole 2 inches higher than the first. And it looked like this. And the thinking behind this treatment was perhaps we could get the sap yields from not just a freshened taphole, but from an entirely new taphole, but by putting it in directly vertically above the first taphole, that we might be able to reduce or limit the overall development of non-conductive wood, because we would be tapping into basically the area where the first hole was going to develop non-conductive wood. That was the logic behind that. You'll see how that worked out in a little bit. All right, and then we also had 3 winter or early winter treatments. And basically early winter is a treatment that reflects sort of capturing early January thaws and late December thaws. So our early winter treatments were either, and they were based on the actual weather that we were seeing, but basically this runs from late or mid to late December to early January, depending on how the weather was shaping up to see when those sap flows are actually going to occur. The fall treatment, basically that one is applied. Certainly the leaves have to be gone. So the dormant season has to have actually started. And then temperatures have to have dropped below freezing in order for that to occur. So basically we did tap these treatments in after we reached below freezing in the fall after leaf drop. And so this varied from year to year. And for our second year, we did all of the same treatments. Like I said, we basically repeated the same study for 3 years. The only difference here was we set our our controlled depth to 2 inches rather than 1.5, because this was a little bit more reflective of practices that we use at the Proctor Center, or we were using at the time. And then in the third year, we had a minor variation in what we were doing. We got rid of that fall second hole treatment, which, as I said before, I'll tell you all about later on. And in its place, we looked at late season reaming. So all of our reaming and rejuvenation treatments here were based on tapping early, or at least in early winter. But of course, there are obviously many people interested in just reaming spring tap holes for the end of the production season. So we added that treatment in the third year. Those were tapholes that we tapped on the same date as our spring control trees. And then later, after the temperature had reached above 50 degrees on 4 days, we re-drilled them deeper to 2.5 inches. And that 4 days of 50 degrees is something, a threshold that Steve Childs from Cornell has noted over his work over the years, that is basically a threshold where taphole drying really starts to speed up. And so that's what we used as our indicator for when those tapholes should be redrilled. And so I just have here in this figure the various dates of the treatments for the different years, just to show that how things can really vary, which you all know, you see this every year. But so our springtime tapping date, like I said, doesn't vary that much. It's based not just on the weather, but it's based on how our operation works. So it's pretty tight from year to year. And then the season end actually ranged all the way from the end of April to the beginning of April. And I should point out that for all of our studies, all of our studies on sap yields in particular, the end of that study is when we begin making buddy, or realistically making sev, in our operation. So once we start to make that late season off flavor, we stop our sap yield experiment. So any of the yields that you're seeing represent basically retail grade syrup. So in 2018, that was all the way up to April 23rd. In 2020, we actually didn't get there. We never made buddy or late season off flavor in our operation. On April 8th, the trees just stopped running based on the weather and the way the season had gone. So there was a lot of variation in that each year, as you all know. And then you can see that there's a pretty wide or somewhat wide variation in when we did our fall treatments and winter treatments based on the weather. So we were everywhere from the third week in October to just after the first week in November for our fall treatments, and everywhere from just after mid-December to all the way to January, mid-January for our winter treatments. And again, this reflects the variable weather in those years. And I do have, before I go there, so here are just some pictures of the equipment that we use. So you can imagine there are 80 of these. There's quite a bit of infrastructure to take care of. And one really important thing to point out about how we did this study, these are 30-gallon collection chambers, but especially when you're tapping in the fall and early winter, once the temperature goes below freezing, it stays below freezing for a really long time. So in order to be able to actually measure the sap volume and sugar content throughout that period, we actually had to put separate empty containers within our 30-gallon canisters so that we could extract those, replace them with an empty one, and bring them inside to thaw out so that we could weigh them to get the sap volume and also measure their sugar content so that we could calculate the overall yield. So it was already difficult to do, and it actually was even more difficult to do than it looks like. So a lot of effort definitely went into doing this. And what I started to say earlier, I put in this presentation the temperatures of the different years that we did the study, to kind of just illustrate that it varied from year to year and that there are different numbers of sap flow days in each of the years. I'm not going to spend time on this, but you can, pause your presentation, pause this video, and check it out yourselves to see if you are interested in it. But definitely there's differences in days of sap flow in these fall and winter periods, and how good they are in the different years. All right, so all of that preamble to get to one figure, one graph of results. These are the overall averages for the 3 years for each of those treatments. And these results are total syrup volume, so not sap volume, but actual syrup equivalent. But instead of being presented as pounds per tap or gallons per tap, these, because we are interested in how much better or worse do these treatments do than a standard spring taphole, those yield results are presented as a percentage of our spring control tapholes. So in other words, if we set the yields from spring control tapholes at 100%, how do the rest of the treatments relate to that? And so if we start over here on the left, we can look at all of our fall treatments. And first foremost, we can look at those fall control holes, those fall tapholes that were just set it and forget it. We put them in and let them go. And you can see that over the 3 years, on average, they yielded 84% of the syrup volume of our standard spring control holes. So in other words, on average, about a 15 to 20% reduction in yield relative to standard spring tapping. So definitely no benefit in capturing those early sap flows from doing that. We can move over here to that fall second hole treatment, where we had two tapholes, one placed in the fall, one placed immediately above it in the spring. And you can see that there was, with this treatment also, no gain in yield. It yielded about the same as our spring control tapholes for twice the work and at least twice the amount of non-conductive wood. We'll talk about that in a minute. So not a very good idea. And also our fall ream and deep tapholes. So these were the 1/4-inch tapholes we put in the fall that we reamed later on to 5/16 inch and 2.5 inches deep. Those also yielded about the same as the spring control taphole for twice the work, an extra spout. So definitely no gain in yield there. But the fall deeper tapholes, these are the ones we put in the fall and just re-drilled from 2 to 2.5 inches in the spring. These resulted in about a 16% on average increase in yield relative to the spring tapholes. So that's kind of interesting. And then if we look at our winter treatments, we can look at the winter control tapholes. So these were the early winter tapholes, so mid-December to mid-January, depending on the year. And we can see that on average, they produced 92% of our standard spring tapholes. So not a huge reduction in yield, but also not the same as our spring control tapholes. So that is something to think about. And then, however, if we go to the winter ream and deep, so the 1/4-inch tapholes that were reamed wider and deeper, and the winter deeper, we see that both of these had about a 20% gain relative to our spring control holes. So that begins to get a little interesting. I'm going to not talk about the late season reaming until later. It's a special case that we'll talk about on its own. So just ignore that for the moment. But before I move on from here, there is something that's worth pointing out. So we see these small or potentially interesting gains, right, from some of our rejuvenation treatments, but this study was lacking one thing that we need to keep in mind, and that is the final taphole depths for each of these treatments. So remember that all of our re-drilled treatments, all of our rejuvenation treatments were a final depth of 2.5 inches, whereas our control hole was only 2 inches. What this study did not have was a control hole that was that same final depth, the 2.5 inch depth. So what I can't say from these results is actually how much of the gain in these freshened or rejuvenated tapholes, how much of that was from capturing early sap flows versus an extra 1/2 inch of depth. And, you know, we have another study at the Proctor Center that was recently published in the Maple Digest that you may have seen and that I've reported on in other places. That study showed that you really don't get too much gain in yield, if any, by going from 2 to 2.5 inches. And so if you extrapolate those results to here, you could say, well, we don't expect much of that gain to be because of just the extra 1/2 inch. It's more likely to be because of capturing those early sap flows also. But because we didn't measure it directly in this study, I can't really say that. So it's an open question. And I'm hopeful that some of the other teams doing some work in this area currently, like at Cornell and WVU, I hope that their studies will help elucidate that, help clarify how much of the gain is from early tapping and how much is from that final taphole depth. So this is as good of time of any to talk about this year, right? So as we were going through the fall of 2020 and we're experiencing what was going on, all of us at the Proctor Center were like, man, it's too bad that that study is over. This would have been the perfect year to look at the yields from tapping in the fall. And certainly we had a lot of weather in the fall of 2020 that was very conducive to sap flow. And so a lot of people have asked, even us, have posed the questions to ourselves, would have tapping in the fall in 2021, a year like 2020, would tapping in the fall in a year like 2020, would that have actually resulted in a better overall yield than we had seen in the years that we did this study from 2017 to 2020? And the answer is obviously, I don't know, because we didn't do the study. So I can only give you my speculation. And that is, you can see here that we had a lot of days of decent sap flow weather in the fall, for sure, no doubt about it. And this was after we had the first freeze. So potentially, and we all know, many of you were making syrup on Christmas Eve. So most, that counts as early winter. So that's a different story too. But anyway, back to the fall. My hypothesis is that first of all, my hypothesis is that we may not have actually seen yields from fall tapping, even in a year like this one, be better off or much better than we observed in the study, the 3 years that we did the study. And that's for two reasons. One, when you actually count the sap flow days for this year, it wasn't really bigger than it was in any of the previous years, although the temperatures were higher, so the flows could have been better. And then, but the big kicker, I think, is here, where we had, at least in Northern Vermont, at the Proctor Center, we had temperatures for numerous days in a row that were 65 degrees and above 70 degrees. My thinking is that this prolonged period of warm weather would have tanked the sanitation of those tapholes, and you would have seen a lot of expedited taphole drying in those fall tapholes that certainly would have put you at a disadvantage all the way toward the late season when we actually had conducive weather to sap flow. So I don't have the answers to that. I'll look forward to hearing from some of the producers that did tap this fall and that have tapped in the fall before to see whether they saw some advantages of the weather that we had this fall. And then there's an overriding factor, which is, yes, the fall yields may not have been that much better, but in a year like this one, where the actual springtime production season was not so great, it's possible that almost sort of as a fluke, tapping in the fall, even if the yields weren't super great, could have been advantageous in this year. So it's kind of complicated to think about, but I'm really looking forward to talking to those of you that did tap in the fall, especially those of you that have done it before, to see what you observe. So call me. Anyway, and this is now, I guess, as good of time as of any to talk about, the elephant in the room, what's on everyone's mind. Why was the sap sugar concentration so low in 2021? And before I say anything, because I'm going to give you my theories and hypotheses of why it was, the carbohydrate balance of trees, especially as they relate to sap sugar in the xylem sap, it is an enormously complex subject with things that affect it all the way from little things to big things to really long things that are distant in time, like years and years before. And in plant biology, it is an area that's well known as something that's like a little bit of a black hole in terms of how we really understand it. We don't. It's super complex. So to give you an answer, why was sap sugar concentration so low this year? I can honestly say, I can give you some ideas and some of my leading thoughts, but really no one has a true answer to this. And it's probably vastly more complex than we can understand. But with that said, here's what I think. So first and foremost, I want to point out that 2020, at least at UVM, at the Proctor Center, our sap sugar content was also lower than average in that year in 2020, not just 2021. So that's something to keep in mind. And then my personal leading contenders for why sap sugar concentration was so low this year has to do with the prevailing weather and climate, at least for the last 3 years. So since 2018, and probably before that too, we have had 3 years of either drought or very dry weather and hot weather. So these two figures are showing snapshots of weeks in 2018 and 2020. And so you can see, even in just these 2-week periods, that you have widespread areas of drought to abnormally dry conditions. And one thing that trees really don't like, especially in the growing season, is a lack of water. So what happens is, when in a response to a lack of water, the leaves, the holes in the leaves that allow water to escape, close down to help prevent water loss. It's a good water saving strategy. But the trade-off, the loss in doing that for a tree or any other plant, is those holes are where carbon dioxide for photosynthesis comes in. And so not only are you kind of slowing things down just because there's not a lot of water, so photosynthesis doesn't happen really well, nothing happens really well when you don't have enough water, but by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that get in for photosynthesis, it decreases photosynthesis way down. And already, if you have lower rates of photosynthesis, you're making less carbohydrates, which means you have less sugar to store that will subsequently be in xylem sap. Now, in addition to this, these weren't just dry years. These have been extremely hot years. And actually, so if we look at the 10 warmest years on record from NOAA, we can see that 2018, 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020 are in the top 6 years of the hottest years on record. And that doesn't just make drought. Of course, it makes drought worse, but it also, the higher the temperatures are, the higher the respiration rate of plants are. So in other words, as it gets hotter, they start using more and more of their fuel, even if they're not making more of their fuel through photosynthesis. So hotter temperatures mean that trees are, like it or not, consuming more and more of their carbohydrate resources just to exist. And this can be especially impactful to a tree when it happens in the fall, because photosynthesis is already lower. So it just kind of fuels, kind of feeds into itself. And you can see that especially in 2018, that the dry conditions and real hot conditions actually happened after the growing season. So after the main part of the growing season for plants. So late August into the fall. All of those things function to reduce the amount of sugar that is available to store in the wood that will subsequently be in the xylem sap when we go to harvest it in the spring. Seed production can also contribute as another sink, another use for the carbohydrate resources. And we did have some seed production in most of these years. And of course, we have during the season some factors that add to that. We have already low soil moisture and very few freeze and thaw cycles and many consecutive warm days. And so the enzymes that are responsible for converting the stored sugar from starch into sucrose and loading it up into the xylem sap where we collect it those enzymes are triggered into action by fluctuations around the freezing point. So you've got to have those freeze-thaw cycles in order to get those enzymes active and get the starch converted to sucrose and loaded into the xylem vessels. So in a season where we also didn't have very many of those, it sort of contributed even more to the problem that we're having. So this is something, or the effects of this are something that we actually saw pretty dramatically in one of our other studies at the Proctor Center. We have this study, I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about it a lot of different times, a study of the impacts of tapping and sap collection on tree growth. So we have a lot of trees out there that are in the same stand that have either never been tapped or tapped with gravity or gravity collection system or vacuum collection. And we've been doing this study since 2013. And you can see that in the beginning of the study, this is the average diameter of each of those, the trees in those treatment groups each year. So you can see that at the beginning of the study since 2013, we're rolling along, the trees are adding new growth each year. And then after that 2018 season, there was no growth at all. And although it picked up a little bit in between, my suspicion is that when we go back and measure these trees this fall, we will see very, very little, if any, growth. So this is something that we're seeing not only in the sugar content of our sap, but also in the radial growth rate of trees. You know, not enough sugar to live, not enough sugar to store, not enough sugar to grow. And so this is something, you know, that will be really interesting and important to keep our eyes on. And yeah, so that's what I have to say about that. Anyway, after that long digression, let's get back to the study. So I promised I would say a little bit on its own about that late season reaming treatment. And like I said before, we reamed those tapholes. We tapped them all in the same time in the spring. And then after those 4 days of temperatures above 50 degrees, we re-drilled them deeper. And so that was March 30th of that year. And the season actually ended just 9 days later. So abruptly, sap stopped flowing. So when I looked at the data and saw that those late season ream tapholes had outproduced the spring control tapholes by 18%, I was impressed. I was surprised and impressed. In 9 days of like not that great weather, those trees produced 18% more sap than the control tapholes. So initially I was, like I said, I was impressed. However, because we were doing the study the way that we did, with being able to extract those containers and measure the sap flow and the production at the various time points of our study, I was able to look back and see what the yields were before reaming and after reaming. And when I did that, I got disappointed. My bubble was burst. So if we look at the yields before we reamed them from those two different treatments, so this is the spring control, and these are the trees that we would subsequently redrill. Before we touch them, the late season ream trees were already outproducing the spring controls by 1/10 of a gallon. And I have no idea why. I really don't. This is just one of those fluky things. But for whatever reason, those trees, before we even touched those tapholes, they were outproducing the spring controls. Then during the sap flows after the late season reaming, the two treatments ran fairly equally. So this 18% gain that we saw, or improvement that we saw in yield, doesn't appear to be from late season reaming. It appears to be an artifact of the fact that these trees were just running better before we actually touched the tapholes. And like I said, I have no idea why. We do see things like this happen in experiments, and it is a hugely important reminder of why we do studies more than 1 year. If I had just done this and saw that gain and said, woohoo, 18%, everybody go ream your tapholes, it would have been a mistake, because that gain in yield appears to have had nothing to do with reaming the tapholes. So again, these are studies or treatments that other teams are looking at. So although our study suggests that there's no gain here, those other studies by other groups, Cornell, WVU, will hopefully help elucidate some of these impacts on yields. But as important as yields are to see whether there's a there, whether any of these strategies are worth doing, as important is understanding some of what the sustainability is, because we did see some benefits or perceived benefits in yields from some of these treatments, at least a little bit. So it's important to take a look at, well, what are we doing? Is this a sustainable practice? So what about non-conductive wood? Like I said before, we know we're making bigger holes. Bigger holes generally make more non-conductive wood. But the question is, how much more? And how do we balance this between the amount of additional sap that we're getting versus the amount of additional non-conductive wood? So how much more non-conductive wood are we getting? And so to do this, we did a study where to determine how much non-conductive wood was generated by 2 of our rejuvenation treatments. And so to do this, we had 20 trees. Each one of them received 2 or 3 tapholes. All of them got a control taphole, a standard spring taphole that was 5/16 inch and 1.5 inch deep. And then all of them received received 1 or both of 2 of our longevity treatments. So some of them received that fall ream deep treatment. So a 1/4 inch spout in the fall that was 1.5 inch deep. And then in the spring, we reamed that to 5/16 inch wide and 2.5 inches deep. And then we also looked at that fall second hole treatment. So standard size taphole in the fall and the same size taphole drilled 2 inches right above it in the spring. So once we did that, the next fall, we cut them all down and then removed the slab that contained each of those taphole stains. And then once we had that slab, we cut it into 2 inch wide segments, beginning through the center of the taphole. And so this is obviously not a maple tree, but the idea is the same. You see that we're cutting it up with a circular saw to get those 2 inch segments. And then each segment for each taphole is then photographed with a digital camera and a scale. So we end up with something like this, or realistically, more often we end up with something like this. So we have our cut through the center of the taphole, and there's our scale so that we know exactly how big it is. And then we have every 2 inches all the way up until it goes away, and all the way from the bottom until the stain disappears. And actually, the stain goes beyond this in this particular tree, but it didn't fit on the slide. But this is 12 inches above, this is 14 inches above. So we're photographing all of these with a scale. And then once we have those, we can use image analysis software to measure the actual area of non-conductive wood in each of those cookies. And then we can take that and use it with the width of that segment, that 2 inches, to calculate the volume of non-conductive wood in each of those segments. And then we sum up the volume in each segment to get the total amount of non-conductive wood for the entire taphole stain. So it's a lot of work, but it is worth it because it really is one of the closest ways that we can get to measuring exactly how much non-conductive wood is made by a particular taphole. And in this study, importantly, what we had were our treatment tapholes. This is a fall ream and deep taphole. We had those tapholes in the same trees as our control. And what we know from studies of taphole wounding that we've done before and that other people have done before, the amount of non-conductive wood that a taphole makes is very, very variable from tree to tree. And so by putting the 2 treatments in the same taphole, we can really eliminate or reduce a lot of that variation. And so that we can always compare how much non-conductive wood is being made by these rejuvenation treatments compared to a controlled treatment taphole in the same tree. Okay, so what do we find? first of all, let's talk about that fall second hole treatment. This is where we discovered that it was not a very good idea. So when I'm looking at the first cookies from that treatment, and this is through the center of the taphole from one of those fall second hole trees, I'm looking at that and saying, oh no, look, I've tapped into non-conductive wood from another taphole. I can't use this. And that was really dumb because obviously I had put the second taphole in that tree. So when I looked at the cookie that was 2 inches above this, I could see what was going on. We were seeing the non-conductive wood column from that second hole. And so the idea of this treatment was to put the 2 tapholes in line so that they would make 1 column of non-conductive wood. But that is not what happened. Trees are not dumb. The 2 different wounds made 2 separate non-conductive wood columns. And initially I was thinking, oh, well, it's just if you don't get them perfectly lined up, they'll make 2 different columns. But if you line them perfectly, you'll make 1. And again, trees showed me that they're not stupid. That wasn't it at all. Whether the tapholes were perfectly lined up or closely lined up or far apart, they all made at least the non-conductive wood for 2 individual columns. And here's just more pictures. These were super fun to look at once we cut them open. But basically, the idea was obviously to reduce the development of non-conductive wood by tapping within the same wounding column. But this treatment generated 2 complete non-conductive wood columns plus more, as you'll see in a moment. So it didn't just reduce the amount of non-conductive wood, it made the non-conductive wood for 2 individual tapholes plus some more. So it was worse than 2 individual tapholes. So not a good idea. And remember that all of that was for no gain in yield. So again, like, aren't you glad that we do the really stupid things so that you don't have to? All right, so here are the actual numerical results of the total amount of non-conductive wood in our treatment, our rejuvenation treatment tapholes compared to the control tapholes in the same tree. So just like I just said, that second hole 2 inches above, those made 211% more non-conductive wood than the control tapholes, the single undisturbed taphole in the same tree. So that means that they didn't just make twice the amount, they made more than twice the amount. And then even more important story is for the reamed wider and deeper treatment. These trees made, or these tapholes made 273% more non-conductive wood than the control tapholes in the same tree. So 2 3/4 times more non-conductive wood. Now, I know what you're saying, and you're right. Of course, there's more non-conductive wood because those tapholes had a larger final size than the control tapholes. They were 2.5 inches deep compared to 1.5 inches deep. However, if we look at the actual size of the final hole here on the left for the controls and for the reamed wider and deeper, and we compare that to the volume of non-conductive wood generated, we see what's going on here. The control tapholes generated about, the non-conductive wood was 38 times the volume of the hole. So that's a lot, but that is what it is. The reamed wider and deeper treatment tapholes generated 61 times the volume of the hole's worth of non-conductive wood. So the non-conductive wood was 61 times bigger than the size of the final hole. So in other words, these rejuvenated tapholes generated proportionally more non-conductive wood than a single taphole of the same final size. So they aren't just making more because they're bigger holes. They're making more because we are redisturbing the initial wound, which makes sense. The tree's response to that taphole wound begins almost, or actually no, it does begin immediately when we make the hole. And so once that process begins, that compartmentalization of that wound, the tissues around and within that column become less able in some ways to respond to further injury. So it doesn't surprise me much at all that there is proportionally more non-conductive wood in a twice disturbed taphole than there is in a single disturbed taphole. Okay, so tying this all back in together, back to our yield results. So looking at just our fall and early winter control tapholes, things that we didn't apply a rejuvenation strategy to, our fall tapholes gave us 84% on average of our spring tapholes. So that's a 15-20% reduction. So unless there are other compelling reasons to do it, fall tapping fall tapping doesn't appear to be a strategy to increase overall yields. Now, of course, if you are in a different situation and perhaps it's much more important to make early season flavored syrup and make a higher production of your crop in that portion of the season versus the late season, then this may become an interesting way to look at things. But again, remember, this yield did not include, and none of our yields here include any late season flavor. So this was 84% of the good production of good flavored syrup for that year. And then our early winter tapping, we saw 92% of the yield of a spring control taphole. And so what this shows me, or what this indicates, is that there's not a significant reduction, not a substantial reduction. So if you're doing this, if you're tapping in late December, early January, just as a practical necessity to get your taps in, you are possibly losing 8 to 10% of your yield. And that may be worth it in the end, depending on the way the math works in your operation for getting everything in. But there's certainly no compelling reason to do it to increase yields from capturing early sap flows. It simply does not look like that's the case. It looks like it's the opposite of that. All right, and as far as our rejuvenation or freshening treatments, well, our fall ream and deep, our 1/4 inch to 5/16 inch holes, those gave us the same yields as our spring control tapholes, so with twice the work and extra costs for spouts and things like that. So that does not seem to be a very good idea. Our other rejuvenation treatments, the fall deeper treatments, the winter ream and deeper treatments, and the winter deeper, all gave us between 15 to 20% more than our control tapholes. However, we don't know how much of that technically was just due to the 2.5 inch depth, the extra 1/2 inch of depth. But more importantly, we now see that there is, with any of these rejuvenation treatments, a significantly and disproportionately greater amount of non-conductive wood from those treatments. So no matter what the yield from those treatments, we strongly advise against implementing them, no matter what. It is bad for the tree, as I'll show you in a moment, or remind you in the moment. It's bad for your yields. But based on what I've seen with the development of non-conductive wood, I cannot recommend any of those practices in any circumstances. So something to think about with deeper tapholes to begin with is that you have a greater chance, if you are reaming deeper, a greater chance of intercepting existing non-conductive wood. And of course, when, you all know this already, but when you tap into an area of non-conductive wood, whether it's a branch scar or a previous taphole, you have basically, the result is much more non-conductive wood than you would have had if that taphole had not intercepted already existing non-conductive wood. And then there are consequences of more non-conductive wood. This is not just me being like tree hugger, like be nice to the trees. This is me saying this is going to hit you in the wallet in a couple of years. So the more non-conductive wood we have in the tapping zone of trees, the greater the chance we have of hitting it when we're tapping. So if the proportion, of non-conductive wood in the tapping zone is essentially equivalent to the chances of hitting it when tapping. So if 20% of the tapping zone of the tree is non-conductive wood, we have a 20% chance of hitting it. And likewise, 60% of it is non-conductive wood. We have a 60% chance of hitting it. So the chances are increasing as non-conductive wood increases. And this very elegant study done by my colleague Mark Iselhart at UVM Extension, where he tapped purposefully into non-conductive wood to quantify the yields that you actually get from tapping into non-conductive wood. What he found in that study was that yields from tapholes drilled into non-conductive wood were not just a little bit lower, they were significantly lower, on average 75% less. And so yields are significantly lower from tapholes drilled into non-conductive wood. So the greater the chances you have of hitting non-conductive wood, the greater the chances you have of significant reductions in yield. So if you are increasing the amount of non-conductive wood that you have in your trees from some of these rejuvenation strategies, then ultimately that is potentially going to end up reducing the yields of the future. You've got an increased amount of non-conductive wood, increased chances of tapping into it, and ultimately obtaining reduced yields. So in the end, that addition of a little of extra non-conductive wood, quite a bit extra non-conductive wood, to get a small potential increase in yield simply isn't worth it in this year, or definitely not 10 years from now. And if you want better yields, like if you are like struggling to get better yields, there are a lot of other ways to get you a 10 to 15 to 20% increase in yield, going everything from taking care of your tubing system to your practices in the sugar house. I could go on all day about different ways to make up that 10%, 20% in yield that don't require you to shoot yourself in the foot by adding a whole bunch of extra non-conductive wood and doing twice the work, if not more. So with that lovely, lovely thought for the future, I want to say thank you. And obviously I can't see any of you right now to tell whether, whether what I'm saying is making sense. So if you have any questions about what I presented today or anything else, do please feel free to reach out to me. And you can see my email here. And I also would invite you to check out some of our resources that are online. You can go to our website, but we also have and are always adding new videos to our YouTube channel, both on production practices. There are seminars like this here. Mapleresearch.org is where you can get the results from all of these studies from all over the place. The UVM Maple Extension Maple Program site has a bunch of presentations and other resources, as well as the UVM Extension Maple Business and Forestry Program website, which has a whole lot of business information, forestry information, tools, and stuff like that. So thank you all very much for tuning in. And like I said before, I hope to see you all really, really soon.